Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take interesting source materials and really pull out the key insights for you.
Basically, we do the heavy reading so you get the core understanding efficiently.
Exactly. Think of it as your shortcut.
And today, well, we're diving into Ibn Arabi, life and ideas. He's a figure who, honestly, is still incredibly relevant, still debated, centuries later.
Hugely influential, left behind this enormous body of work, didn't he? Like over 400 texts. Future had, Fusus.
That's right, the big ones. And yeah, his legacy is complex, seen as a great saint by many, but viewed quite differently by others, a real paradox.
Definitely. And to help us navigate this, we're using Claude Addis's book, The Voyage of No Return. We'll focus on parts of it to, map out his life and unpack those big ideas.
So if you've heard of Ibn Arabi, maybe felt a bit intimidated by the sheer volume of his work or the complexity.
Yeah, this is for you. We're aiming for those aha moments, A solid foundation without drowning you in detail.
Okay, should we jump in? Let's do it. So his early life, born in Murcia, 1165. And initially it looked like he might follow his father into a military career.
Right, sort of the expected path.
But then around 15, something big happened, a major inner shift. Addis calls it a dazzling metamorphosis. It's quite a striking contrast, isn't it, from that military track to, well, where he ended up.
And part of that involved a really key meeting with Averroes in Cordoba, the famous philosopher.
Yes. Ibn Arabi was still young, and he'd just come from this spiritual retreat. Said he'd experienced illuminative knowledge, like direct insight.
Wow. And Averroes, the great rationalist, he wanted to know, what if this direct insight matched up with philosophical reasoning?
Pretty much. Like, does your mystical flash arrive at the same truths my logic does?
Yeah.
And Ibn Arabi's answer was, well, it was memorable.
What did he say?
Yes and no. Between yes and no, spirits take the flight and necks are detached.
Okay, so deliberately enigmatic.
Exactly. Really pointing to the limits of just logic when you're talking about direct spiritual experience, right? Suggests there's another level of understanding. That meeting seems to have been a real catalyst.
It sounds like it, because soon after, he just walks away from his old life.
Completely.
Mm-hmm.
Withdraws, retreats into a cave, intense spiritual focus. He even called his previous life my Jahiliyyah.
The pre-Islamic age of ignorance? That's a strong statement.
It really is. Shows the radical break he felt he'd made. This was the start of his jaiba, that powerful spiritual pull, that rapture. And then, of course, you need the via purificativa.
The path of purification.
Yeah.
To sort of integrate that intense experience.
Precisely. You need to ground it, understand it. And during this time, he had a really significant vision.
The one with Muhammad, Jesus, and Moses.
That's the one. And interestingly, he called Jesus his first master on the way, highlighting this kind of universal core in his initial guidance.
And Moses gave him knowledge. Muhammad told him to hold fast.
Yes. Moses bestowed knowledge from God. Muhammad said, "Hold fast to me and you shall be safe." It clearly shaped his view of his own path and how these traditions connect. It wasn't about choosing one over the others.
It's good to remember the human side, too. His father eventually came around to accepting his son's path.
He did, later in life. And even Arabi himself, taking that Quranic idea of our human dependence on God very seriously.
He renounced his possessions.
All of them. Total dedication to the spiritual path. A powerful commitment.
So, following the Prophet Muhammad's example then became absolutely core for him.
Utterly central. He believed following the Prophet's way, the Sunnah, meticulously, was the only path to spiritual perfection. Not just rituals, but embodying the inner state.
And connected to that is his idea of the Muhammadan reality, right? The pre-existence of Muhammad.
Yes, the idea that Muhammad wasn't just a historical figure, but cosmically, the first being created, the origin and goal of everything.
That gives the Prophet a huge cosmic significance.
Immense. It underpins his whole understanding of prophethood and sainthood, Walaya. He saw Muhammad as the perfect mirror of the divine attributes, the source from which all sainthood flows.
This wasn't a totally new idea, but he really developed it.
Exactly. He took existing threads and wove them into this comprehensive doctrine.
And this quest sent him traveling. Andalusia, North Africa.
Yes, seeking out spiritual masters. He really wanted to meet Abu Madian, a major figure. Didn't meet him directly, but...
He met his disciple in Tunis.
Right, Abdelaziz al-Madawi, around 1194. Spent nearly a year there. There's a telling story from a sea voyage around then.
Oh, yeah?
A faqih, a legal scholar, was terrified during a storm, criticizing the Sheikh al-Madawi for being calm. But the Christians on board apparently respected the sheikh and were contemptuous of the fearful faqih.
Shows the power of that inner state, doesn't it?
It does. And that time in Tunis was crucial for Ibn Arabi. It's where he said he entered God's vast land, the Alam al-Khayal.
The imaginal world. Now, we need to be clear, this isn't just imagination in the everyday sense.
No, absolutely not. For him, it was a real ontological level, an intermediate realm, a bridge, an isthmus, connecting the sensory world and the purely spiritual divine world, a place of pure worship where meanings take form.
Okay, so it's in this imaginal realm that certain kinds of spiritual experiences happen.
Exactly, like what he called formless theophanies, divine manifestations without a specific material shape. Perceiving these could lead to fana.
Extinction, the dissolution of the ego.
Yes, the falling away of the sense of a separate self in the face of the divine. He talked about a night of being, where what has never been, our illusion of separateness, just vanishes.
Powerful stuff. And that leads us towards Mecca, right? Around 1202, the Meccan illuminations.
A hugely significant period. Near the Kaaba, he has encounters with this mysterious figure, the Fata, the young man, a recurring guide in his visions.
Symbolizing divine inspiration, maybe?
That seems to be the interpretation. And it's in Mecca he receives this spiritual investiture as the Mohammedan seal.
Okay, we'll need to unpack that seal concept more. But Mecca was clearly a time of massive spiritual and intellectual output for him.
Absolutely. Many of his most famous doctrines really crystallize here. Chief among them, perhaps, is Wadat al-Wujud.
The unicity of being, which can be easily misunderstood.
Very easily. It's not simply saying everything is God. It's more like only God possesses being, wujud, in the absolute independent sense. Everything else, all mawjud, all existing things, borrow their existence from God.
So God is the single underlying reality of all things, but things aren't identical to God.
That's a much better way to put it. And linked to this is the idea of the ayam thabita.
The non-existentiated possibles, or eternal exemplars. Sounds complex.
It is a bit, but think of them as the eternal blueprints or essences of things residing within God's knowledge before they exist outwardly. God knows himself, and in knowing himself, he knows all possibilities.
So creation is God bringing these possibilities, these essences, into actual existence based on his knowledge.
Exactly. And this is tied into the divine names and attributes the merciful, the knowing, the powerful, and the most holy effusion, al-Fayd al-Akasha. That initial self-disclosure of the divine essence that allows the names to manifest in creation.
Wow, okay. And this leads to that really expansive idea that God possesses a face in everything that is worshipped.
Yes, that ultimately, no matter the form of worship, consciously or unconsciously, it finds its way back to the one true object of worship, God.
That's a radical idea in some ways.
It is, and central to receiving this is the heart. Not just the physical organ, obviously.
The spiritual heart, the famous Hadith Qudsi. My heavens and my earth do not contain me, but the heart of my believing servant contains me.
Precisely. It highlights the incredible capacity of the human heart to reflect, to contain the divine. He even talked about the God created by beliefs.
Meaning?
Meaning our conception of God is inevitably shaped by our own capacity and perspective. We grasp God according to our own vessel, as it were. It acknowledges the subjective element in religious experience.
Okay, let's circle back to the seal of sainthood idea. Walaya, sainthood, is tied to Muhammad's legacy for him.
Deeply. He talks about this hierarchy, this assembly of saints, Duan al-Aliyah, who maintain cosmic order. Includes figures like the afraid, the solitary ones.
And he saw himself in a specific role within this, the seal of Mohammedan sainthood.
Yes, he made a distinction. He saw Jesus as the seal of general sainthood, sort of closing the cycle of prophecy and universal sainthood. But he, Ibn Arabi, was the seal specifically for the sainthood derived from the Mohammedan inheritance.
And he believed he was told this in a vision back in Cordoba.
Yes, in 1190. Again, the idea of a seal of saints wasn't entirely new. It existed in earlier Sufism, but he gave it the most detailed treatment and placed himself in that concluding role for the Mohammedan line.
It's quite a claim. Yet despite these very high-level spiritual claims, he was incredibly strict about following the law, the Sharia.
Absolutely. He had no time for people who claimed their inner knowledge meant they could ignore the outward rules. That was a complete misinterpretation for him.
So inner and outer had to go together.
Completely. He saw the entire law as reflecting the spiritual states of the Malamiyah, the people of blame.
Who are they again?
Saints who deliberately hide their spiritual station by being almost hyper-correct in their outward observance, avoiding any show of piety. For Ibn Arabi, Adhering strictly to the law was the path. He also tended towards literal interpretations of Scripture, finding meaning even in God's silences.
But he differentiated between ordinary believers and those on the path.
Yes, he argued for leniency in applying the law to the general community. But for those consciously pursuing the spiritual path, the standard was much, much stricter. No shortcuts.
So later life, he travels to Anatolia, Konya, invited by Rumi's father.
Majd al-Din Rumi, yes. He settled there for a time, married again. His wife Fatima actually became one of his students, and crucially, this is where his main disciple, Sadr al-Din Quinawi, emerges.
Quinawi was really important for spreading his ideas, wasn't he? Systematizing them.
Hugely important. Quinawi was key to making Ibn Arabi's often dense and visionary work more accessible and integrated into mainstream Islamic thought, especially in the East.
But it wasn't smooth sailing. There was significant opposition.
Whoa, definitely. Not universally accepted at all. Figures like Ibn Taymiyyah, who initially had some respect, later became fierce critics. Ibn Khaldun issued a fatwa, a legal ruling, against his ideas.
Serious stuff. Yet his influence persisted.
It did. There were always defenders, like Amir Abd al-Qadir, centuries later. And its teachings spread in various ways through dense scholarly commentaries, yes, but also through vernacular poetry, reaching people far and wide.
He spent his last years in Damascus.
Yes. And interestingly, despite the controversy, Sultan Selim I, the Ottoman conqueror, later commissioned his mausoleum there, which became a major pilgrimage site. It shows his enduring status.
And he himself felt the urgency to teach, that, quote, benefit from my existence before I leave.
Yeah, it really speaks to his sense of mission, his need to share the vast ocean of knowledge he felt he'd been granted.
So wrapping this up, we've journeyed through quite a life. That early transformation, the deep, mystical insights.
The core ideas like Wadad al-Wujud, the imaginal world, his whole complex understanding of sainthood and the seal.
And also that surprising emphasis maybe on sticking strictly to the law. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. Our aim here was to give you, the listener, a solid foothold, an accessible entry point into this major, major figure.
Hope we've managed that. And maybe a final thought to leave you with.
Well, the fact that Ibn Arabi still sparks such debate, such devotion, and such criticism centuries on, it really tells you something about the depth and maybe the challenging nature of his contribution.
It makes you think, how do these ideas about divine unity, about human potential, about the imaginal, how do they resonate or maybe even challenge us today?
Exactly. It's a question worth pondering.
Absolutely. So consider this deep dive just the start. There's so much more to explore in his own writings and the scholarship around him. It's definitely a fascinating journey if you choose to continue it.